It started with a video. Shocking, brutal, and in my eyes, an obscenity. As a veterinary physiotherapist, I knew what I was seeing wasn't just harsh, it was unacceptable. So I recorded my reaction, and like so many in the equestrian world, I waited to see what would happen next. The public outcry was fierce. The governing body had to respond. But was it enough? Now, in this podcast series, I break down the scandal, the reactions, and the resolutions that followed, tracing the journey from Olympic glory to the moment everything unravelled. This is Charlotte Dujardin, the scandal, the backlash, the consequences. I'm Caroline Lindsay, horsesaddlerider.com. Let's begin. In this episode, guest presenter Bradley Whale shares his views on using AI, artificial intelligence, for marking dressage tests.
And I'm going to be quite controversial here. I totally agree with an AI judge, but it needs to be based on the rules, not the results.
A very warm welcome to you all. So today I'm delighted to welcome the great Bradley Whale of Ipertain Saddles, saddle design innovator, who is also an osteopath, human and equine, and clinical educator.
One thing which I see talked about a lot is the AI judge, or the potential of using artificial intelligence in judging. Now, oddly enough, I have quite a lot of knowledge on this because I am that nerd, and I have been involved with conversations regarding AI judging. And I'm going to be quite controversial here. I totally agree with an AI judge, but it needs to be based on the rules, not the results. So the inclusion of an independent objective judge would greatly improve the overall performance of pretty much all horses and riders. It categorically would, because you have a system which then doesn't lie. There is no emotional response to it. The difficulty is the AI and how it learns. So AI learns on huge amounts of data, huge. But the problem is that if the data is wrong, then you're going to get the wrong result. Okay, so if let's just use the head carriage or the head position behind the vertical, let's just keep it relatively simple.
Yeah.
If you have 10,000 hours of data which show that the horse's head is behind the vertical, but yet they still get a high performance result, i.e. they still win, okay, then what's going to happen is the AI learns that head position equals winning. So all of a sudden, your AI system is now biased. Okay, you have to base it on the rules, not the results, which then brings about another avenue of problem. Now, I'm going to talk about something which I actually sat down to give you a bit of clarity. I've been involved with AI systems because they use an AI system as an AI judge in boxing. Okay. So where they monitor the number of hits which a boxer takes at Olympic level. And they were using that in the last Olympics as a way to level everything out. Lots of controversy in other aspects of boxing, but you know, in terms of hitting and all of that, it was very, very good and very accurate. But the problem is that if you have to put in the parameters, that means, okay, if you're going to use an AI system, you have to write down every parameter from head carriage to degrees of elevation of the front limb. And you have to do it as a percentage almost. Okay, but you then suddenly have to create all of these parameters for every single situation. Stride length, okay, in walk, trot, canter, degrees of elevation, degrees of extension, head positioning. You suddenly have to quantify the horse into a set of numbers. That is nigh on impossible, okay, for every situation, because you're basing it on rules, not results, okay? So it is doable, but it is a monumental task. Can be done like anything, but it is huge. One thing which I kind of got speaking to an AI system which wanted to do an AI judge for the equestrian industry. They had based it on the results. The person which they put up was a specific individual, but they were given a number. So they had kind of basically tried to isolate things as much as possible. And I sat there in the meeting room and everything, and they showed me this, and I was like, that's amazing. It's brilliant. Right. Okay. Can I just do something? Can you put the rider's name in? So it's not a number. It is now a name. Can you put the rider's name in as Charlotte? And I only use Charlotte as an example, but I did. I actually used Charlotte. And suddenly that I said, run through the examination process, the AI judging system again, but with the rider's name as Charlotte. Now, in theory, the result shouldn't have changed, but it did.
It did.
Because they had based it on results. And because they based it on results, suddenly the computer program, the AI system, had learnt that people with the name Charlotte tended to get better results.
Yeah. Oh my God.
It was exactly the same person. It was exactly the same AI, like kind of riding test. But I said, just change the name to Charlotte. The number went up. The result got better. So I said, right, okay, now change the last name. And they did. And again, the result went up. Because the computer program had learnt that that specific individual was associated with that response. Therefore, an association had occurred because they just went through reams and reams and reams and reams and reams of data. And that is where the problem occurs. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of AI needs to be based on rules, and it should not be based on results. And that means that then you have to put a rider as a number, not as their name. So you have to suddenly remove the individuality. And this is the difficulty. You have to remove the individuality in order to get a very pure response and a very pure answer. Now, as I say, it is doable. You can do this. You can create a system which is based on rules, but it means that you have to quantify and you have to provide measurable parameters on everything.
Question. Do the AI judge learn as it judges?
Yes.
Or it just, okay.
So it learns as it judges.
Yeah.
So it also, and that's also the problem, is that once you get into a negative, that's why you have to keep it very pure at the beginning.
Yeah.
Because if it's impure in any way, shape, or form, then all of a sudden that has a greater potential to get exaggerated later on down the line.
Yeah.
And obviously there are not enough horses that move healthily for AI judging, because
exactly.
it just sounds ridiculous. So
which is why, as I said, you have to have parameters. You have to kind of say, right, like you have to define the vertical.
Yeah.
You have to define how long the horse is going to be behind the vertical.
Yeah.
For how many seconds? Before you start judging it negatively.
Yeah.
You're looking at a system which is measuring in microseconds.
Yeah.
Not seconds or tens of seconds. You have to put that parameter in. You have to put a parameter in of stride length, and you have to put a parameter in of stride length in comparison to height. So all of a sudden then your parameters, when the AI system is judging, you suddenly have to, if you said, right, the horse is 16 hands and you had the parameter of an 18-hand horse, so do you see the slight difficulty? You suddenly have to put in a little bit more data.
Yeah.
But then the AI system has something to work with.
So that it's relative. So, for example, I believe that normal healthy movement, horse movement, has a wither lift. But obviously a bigger horse is going to have a bigger wither lift.
Yes.
May win.
For example, like the wither lift, you have to then have a parameter at the beginning where it is stable and static before you see wither lift. So if you're using wither lift as an example, you've got to have a picture or a parameter which says That's the starting point. That's the degree of elevation of the wither. If you don't have that beginning starting point and the horse is already elevated, then the computer says, well, it hasn't elevated, because that's the point which we're starting the assessment.
AI can or should pick up the asymmetry, or certainly AI is a bit out there for me, and to me, as you say, it's somewhat ridiculous at times and illogical. But I think we can use technology to measure, but it will pick up on the asymmetry. It will pick up on the ranges of motion, and it should pick up on the expression of the gait. So making the subjective score objective.
Yeah, it will be able to do that. But again, it comes down to, at least at the beginning, you have to put in all of the parameters. And that's why I say it has to be parameter driven, i.e. rules driven. It can't be results driven.
No.
Now, a lot of AI systems are driven by results, and that has been proven. I think it was proven by Harvard University, where they basically put an AI system and they fed it nothing but right-wing propaganda and left-wing propaganda, and basically gave it more right-wing propaganda, and then asked it a series of questions, and it came up with right-wing results, if you see what I mean. And I'm talking about this in political terms, which basically proved that an AI system is only as good as the data which you feed it. So, and that's where the difficulty comes. So anybody who kind of says, right, let's use AI, you're sat there going, yes, but otherwise you're going to be basically perpetuating the problem which already exists.
Yeah, that is the problem, that we know there's a movement problem, so therefore you can't base the system on poor movement, because we're just perpetuating the problem. Annette, I want to know what you think about this as a rider.
It's extremely complex. Think just about, if we go back to the vertical, in canter, you have the entire horse's movement, different horses' movement, and you're going to somehow take into account where the vertical is. It's a lot of data that needs to be correct for that to work. It's an interesting aspect to have AI judging. And then again, we're back to horses and their beings. But much of the asymmetrical we see in competition depends on the horse being tense. And that tension comes out often as movement differences.
My personal opinion on AI judging is that it would be brilliant, but more as a, if there is a controversial, if there is something where you're sat there as a rider and you're going, actually, I think my movement was better than the score which the judge gave me. Therefore, can I refer to the AI judge independently, rather than having an AI judging system which is all the time? If you see what I mean. I think having it as a reference, like what they do in football or tennis or anything like that, where you can request, you can turn around and go, right, I want to request that the AI judge looks at my test and gives me a result. And if it is within a half a point of the judge's result, okay, fine. But if it's outside by half a point, then we go with the AI judge. There's also a moral question, is that it's quite intimidating, the potential of having a computer system override a judge. There's a lot of ethics and various things like that which need to be taken into consideration. And also, like anything, people will learn how to gain the system. There's ways of doing it. And there's also a cost thing as well. You know, having certain cameras set up in every situation is not going to work. But having them set up at major competitions is going to work. But then you have people which are then going, it's like, I deal with people who know how to gain the system at a competition by doing certain things to hide certain movements with their body and various things like that. They're you know, they kind of do stuff like that. So then you're kind of like, well, okay, what's morally right, morally wrong? And you have that grey zone. But yeah, it becomes more difficult for riders. because all of a sudden you feel threatened almost. And there would be a lot of kickback with the use of AI, a huge amount of kickback, because all of a sudden you'd have potentially big performers who would then be knocked down some result.
Yes.
And
some of them deserve it.
Yes, but that's why I say is AI would be amazing, but we've got to have a much bigger conversation about it within the industry in terms of ethics, morality, the impact on the industry, the impact on individuals, the way the AI system is taught, the potential for bias, all of these types of things, and also the impact it has on us as riders. Being judged, all of a sudden, being judged by another human, you can kind of go to the human afterwards and go, okay, you've given me that result. Why? What is it that you are looking for? What is it that I need to do in my training to make it better as a judge from your perspective? With an AI system, you don't do that. You can't get that. It's very much kind of devoid of the human, if you see me, or devoid of humanity. It won't give you a kind of going, right, okay, you could work on this, or you could look at this. I'm playing devil's advocate because, you know, humans, there's always going to be a bias in some way, shape, or form. AI, you're not. But I'm playing devil's advocate because you kind of have to sit on both sides of the story on this one.
Yes.
So if we were to somehow program some healthy horse movement that we can all agree with, and as Annette says, there's a bit of an issue with tension here.
Yep.
But we can have rein tension sensors, for example. We can identify blue tongue, the big picture things like that shouldn't be happening. Stamp that out. If they weren't pulling like trains on the reins, then they'd be perfectly open to rein sensors. But Annette, what do you think about sensors? Perhaps something that checks how many times you kick a horse, or you'll use a spur on a horse, and that if we had a device that could measure that force as well, if we can really get using the technology that perhaps is available.
Rein tension shouldn't be a problem to assess. That should be able to do by attaching something between the bit and the rein.
Yeah,
I don't think that's a problem.
Okay.
However, spur, that is more difficult, but it's also very visible. I think judges overall can see when the spurs are added in every step. That shouldn't be something that needs any sort of tracking device. Then again, if we take it just under observation, I don't think not any tension is better than too much tension. I think it depends on how you do it, because I think you can have a fair amount of pressure in the horse's mouth if it's steady. I don't think they necessarily think that it's uncomfortable. I think an uneven contact is worse.
Okay.
But that goes back to kind of suddenly the governing system having the ability to turn around to the industry and go, right, we're actually now going to create quantifiable measurements. So we are now going to force you to have rein sensors on your competition horses in competition.
Yes.
That's where the governing body has to be almost quite militant to that degree and kind of go, right, the only way we can measure you with your rein tension is by putting sensors on.
Yeah.
And my argument would be there should be absolutely no problem with that. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to show that rein tension all the time, but you could get a rein tension score at the end.
Yeah.
There's ways of doing it.
Yes.
So that you I'm going to say it in a slightly horrible way, but where you force the professionals or the competitive element to kind of go, right, you think you have good hands, that's absolutely fine, that's not a problem. Let's just put a sensor on and everybody's going to do it, and you're all going to get a mark out of it, and it doesn't affect the result in any way, shape, or form. But you start to see it being encroached in.
Yes.
So people get annoyed, they get frustrated, they get peed off, they have their arguments, but ultimately it doesn't matter immediately. And that's my issue and I'll talk about it later, in terms of the governance, is that the governance doesn't seem to be proactive in terms of implementing certain things or certain structures and having clear communication with the industry to say, we are going to implement this. We are starting now, so you get used to it, so you have a period of adaptation. They don't do that. The governance very much turns around and goes, right, this has happened, therefore we're reacting this way, and now we're stopping you doing X, Y, and Z. Now, in certain situations, that's fine, but going forward, using like a rain tensioner, that would be my piece of advice: is you sit there and go, right.
And when I talk about if you have a higher degree of tension, I am talking about a kilo, 2 kilos, much, because I think many people think they have like half a kilo tension, and it's maybe up to 3, 4, and 5 kilograms. I think it's exponentially higher than people think. Personally, I like to have very soft reins. I think that's most comfortable.
You also then have to put in a parameter of how long is too long. Is rein tension held for 1 second? Is that allowable? But yet rein tension held for 1.5 seconds, not allowable. Therefore, you will have people, and I'm going to say this, like myself, who will look at the results, look at the numbers, and go, right, you can gain the system by having rein tension for 1.4 seconds and still not get penalized for it. And that's how sport works, and you see it in every sport. You put in a parameter, you put in a restriction. There are very intelligent people who will then basically work out what they can do to get around it, to get the best performance. And that's the problem, is that you will have, as what you said in there earlier, psychopaths who will literally look at that and they will go, right, how can I go right up to the rule line but not break it? So, and that, there's ways around it. You can say, right, we're going to start off with an allowable kind of time of 1.5 seconds. After that, that is too much tension. And then slowly, incrementally change that number on the sensor, and you can bring it down. There's ways to do it.
From what I've read, what I understand is that the FEI have basically said, no, we're not going to react. We want the science. So I think to actually say, look, let's monitor this for a period of time, but let's get some data on rein tension.
The FEI can do it themselves. They don't need to wait on somebody else externally, and that's the other.
They need to do that, but then they need to correlate that with mouth injury, bruising, blue tongue, so that they need to say, okay, X number of horses, X number of kilos pressure did not have these injuries, but these did. In science, we can't hurt horses to get some data, but what we can do is collect data from what's already occurring. And I think just collecting that data will make the riders more aware.
It will do, absolutely. It will make riders more aware, but equally, you've got to remember is that it's the FEI or any governing body which has to do the research. It can't come from individuals.
Would they be biased though? Shouldn't they be?
Well, theoretically, a governing body should not be biased. Theoretically, a governing body is there to preside over the governance of the industry. Well, an individual company which comes in with rein tensioners and a rein tension system could be seen to be being biased. Therefore, the FEI or any governing body, and this is a general rule within any industry, is that there are certain things in order to change the governance, the governing body has to do the research. Therefore, it is seen as not being biased. Difficulty is, in the horse world, there is nothing for research for governing bodies. There is no money left for the governing body to perform their own research.
Of all the billions that are spent on
funny that.
funny, isn't it? The governing bodies exist for their members.
Yes.
So
You're typically correct. A governing body exists for its members. You are absolutely correct. The difficulty is that the equine industry, unlike any other sport in the world, we also have an obligation for horse welfare or animal welfare, direct animal welfare.
but
So therefore, yes, you govern your members, but you also have a responsibility to an animal which doesn't have a voice. So my argument is that the industry should be slightly, to put a number on it, 51% more in favor of the horse and 49% in favor of the rider. You know, and that's because the horse doesn't have a direct line of communication. A rider does. So any changes within the industry should be done in mind with the horse being the priority, rider second.
And I think, sorry, I'll come to it in a second, Annette, but I think when you get a governing body that basically is governing a set of competitions worldwide or internationally, it's hard to put pressure on that governing body, although I would argue that the Olympic Committee is higher.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
They are going to
especially the conversations which are being had at the IOC, so the International Olympic Committee, about.
You've got inside info on that?
No, but I know that
I won't tell anyone.
certain conversations were being had with the IOC about whether equestrianism would continue within the ethos of the Olympics.
Yeah, which
and I know that sounds really odd, but the Olympics only is on for a certain number of days.
Yeah,
and it's also run as a business, and they've noticed that viewer numbers do drop during equestrian events in comparison to the early 2000s and various things like that. And they're saying, okay, is this a trend? Is the community, the worldwide community, starting to kind of not be so in tune with horse riding? And that's why, if you notice, with every Olympic Games now, they include sports which they think may increase viewer numbers. So, for example, I think it was in the most recent Olympics, I think it was breakdancing was a show performance, as in a show sport. It wasn't actually part of the official Olympic lineup. So they quite often, the IOC kind of are, they run it as a business. They've got to look at numbers and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, and it especially didn't help with what happened with Charlotte, literally days before the competition. And that adjusted viewer numbers quite a lot. And
that incident, I mean, to me, the Olympics stands for sportsmanship, not cheating or, not bad ethics. So, when you look at it in that context, equestrianism doesn't really belong there. And of course, eventing costs a whole heap of money to put on, doesn't it? Because of the cross-country course. So putting that on in cities may be problematic. So unfortunately, we are all aware that the days may be numbered. It will happen in the next Olympics, but perhaps not the one after. Annette, what do you think?
I think we're back to not taking account to that horses are alive, because you can't take it as a football or a tennis racket.
Yeah.
You really need to understand horses are living creatures, and sad that we have come to this point that we expect them to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if it is about horse welfare, and that if we can get technology to define horse welfare, then maybe it will survive. But I think it's quite late in the day, unfortunately, because I don't want to see equestrianism lost from the Olympics. I don't want to see it lost at all. But as usual, the minority are ruining it for the majority. When you consider what horses give us, we're talking about sport horses here, not the everyday horse, but it would be horrible if all horse riders were unable to ride.
I'm going to be a little bit crass here. I don't think that it will be removed. Not for if it was, there's got to be a load of serious events, and I mean welfare events, to happen in between now and the Olympics. And it's also timing. If there's a kind of issue, kind of events occurring before the Olympics doesn't like it because it's bad rep. But you've got to remember, like my slide right at the beginning, it's the shadow industry. It's worth 300 billion a year.
Yeah.
This is a massive industry. It is humongous. It is not going to be dropped. Just kind of like, okay, right, we're having nothing to do with it. Things are run like a business. So if it can pull people in and people are interested and it gets people talking, then yes, it'll very much stay. But as I said, there's a lot of other things at play, such as costing of events and various things like that. To set up as you kind of said, set up an eventing competition takes a lot, but equally the payoff for it is quite large as well. You've got to remember is in the UK when we had the Olympics here, so we got to showcase various other aspects and parts of the country. So there is a benefit to it. Whether that starts to become a problem for the IOC or it becomes a problem for the company is where the issues occur, if you see what I mean. But Annette's absolutely right. And this is where I say it later, is that we have removed I argue, the humanity of the horse, the individuality of the horse, to create more of a product. But that's also because of other things.
And the nobility of a horse. We're just completely exploiting their wonderful natures and the work that a horse can do in equine assisted therapy is just stunning.
Absolutely.
And maybe that's what we should be appreciating horses for, and less of the sport. And perhaps as more mental health becomes an issue, then perhaps there will in the future, in 50 years time, the horse will be recognized for the therapy more so than the sport or the therapy of sport.
Okay, so the one thing which we focus on is the Olympics. Okay, as an event, it's nicknamed a circus for a reason, because it is a traveling circus essentially. But the one thing which we always forget, and this is something which really does pee me off because I have a bit of passion for this, is that we talk about the Olympics, but we very rarely actually talk about the Paralympics. And it's kind of a little bee in my bonnet, because I'm just like, hang on. You got a whole other section of the Olympics and the Olympic ideology, which is the paras. And I have a lot of time for para athletes. I will quite happily, and I have ignored high performance individuals to go and sit with the paras, and I love them. I think they've got a great sense of humor. But the point is that one of the sports which is most watched in para Olympics is equestrianism. So there's always this kind of double-edged kind of sword to this. Yes, there's been issues, but watching Paralympics and Paralympian dressage, that is one of the most watched sports in the Paralympics. So
they're the real Olympians, aren't they?
I have opinions of it and whatnot, which but the point is that there's always this other side going on, because like as you're saying about kind of for mental health and all these other aspects, yes, but let's not be too negative in regards to performance horses and the Olympics and all of that type of stuff. It is going to be around for a long time. It is. God forbid nothing else happens, but God forbid it all kind of stays. Personally, I think the only thing go on.
Sorry, it's not sustainable in its current form.
In its current form, you're absolutely correct.
The threat of social license is massive. We haven't talked about that yet, but I mean, you mentioned
social license is humongous.
If you found this episode thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, leave a review. It really helps more equestrians and horse lovers find the podcast. You can also join the conversation on the Horse Saddle Rider YouTube channel. And finally, I'll be giving you more insights into the equestrian world. So be sure to come back and join me so that together we can campaign for better conditions for our sport horses.